Hello. If you're new here, my name is Ari. I'm an aspiring author, and if you're not new here, welcome back. Today, I want to talk about beta reader feedback. Back in September, I wrote a literary fiction short story titled The Fading Gene that was heavily inspired by having recently lost my dog. I put out a beta reader request, and the log line was, "A girl newly diagnosed with cancer gets a puppy." And shout out to Kit and Tom, who are my two wonderful beta readers for The Fading Gene. They provided beta reader feedback, but they also kindly allowed me to share their feedback on this video. So what I wanted to do today is actually go through their beta reader feedback and come up with kind of like a short story revision plan for The Fading Gene. And I thought it would be especially helpful because notoriously Kit and Tom tend to disagree on various books and things that they tend to read. And this was not different from my short story. So I think that this video is also going to be really helpful to show you how to tackle beta reader feedback just generally, but how to tackle beta reader feedback when beta reader feedback doesn't necessarily agree with one another. So I hope this video is helpful. Let's get right into it. So I think I'm not going to share the short story because one day I might try to get it published, but I do want to share my beta questionnaire. And if you don't know what a beta questionnaire is, it's basically just like a list of questions that tend to be provided to beta readers, but I tend to like to beta read with beta questionnaires, and I like to provide them because I think it allows you as an author to really pinpoint the specific questions that you have. Because let's say you're providing a story to beta readers that you know has certain problems with it, but you want them to look out for certain other things. So a beta questionnaire kind of helps guide the beta readers into giving you answers about the things that you're particularly concerned about, because you can have a beta reader kind of go in and you know you have like a tense problem, for example, but you want them to kind of ignore that because you know you're going to go in later. Like, I'm not suggesting you should provide a piece of work with a tense problem to beta readers, but this is just kind of an example. It's kind of helpful to get feedback on the things that you're specifically interested in hearing about. So my beta questionnaire was a list of 10 questions, and the short story was actually quite short. It was only 2,269 words. So in terms of short story, that's actually really short. I think flash fic can be up to 1,000 words, and I think short stories tend to be between 1,000 and 10,000 words, most falling, between the 5,000 to 7,500 word range. So mine was like reasonably short, actually. I did take an interesting stance on the story with like narrative distance, and that was actually kind of intentional. The story was meant to be kind of almost like vignette format. There's supposed to be a very far narrative distance. I wanted to know if that actually worked or if it was like too distant. So here are my questions. At what point in the story were you most emotionally engaged? Were there any points where your attention drifted or where the pacing felt slow or rushed? Did the story flow logically? Were there any moments where the narrative felt disjointed or confusing, or where the timeline was unclear? And I specifically asked that question because the story takes place over quite a long period of time as well. So because it's such a long period of time, like there's going to be jumps. So I wanted to make sure that those jumps weren't super jarring. The narrator in the story is definitely at a distance. We don't get many details about them. Did that bother you, or do you think it was effective? Which moments felt the most emotionally powerful to you? Were there any scenes that felt flat or felt forced? Did you feel there was too much telling versus showing? This was something that I was actually really concerned about, the telling versus showing, because there's a lot of telling because it's at such a narrative distance and because it's short and because it spans such a long period of time. What themes stood out to you the most, like love, loss, healing, companionship? Did the story explore these themes in a way that felt meaningful and natural? Did the narrator's voice feel authentic and consistent throughout the story? Were there any passages where the tone felt off or out of place? How effective were the descriptions of emotions, settings, or actions? Were there any points where more or less detail would have improved the narrative? How did you feel about the ending? Did it provide a sense of closure or leave you wanting more? Was there anything that felt unresolved or overly explained? What specific scenes or lines stayed with you after finishing the story? Were there any moments you think could be cut or reworked without impacting the narrative? I think a lot of this questionnaire tended to be like large developmental stuff because I think at the line level I wasn't super worried about it, and I wanted more like developmental stuff for the short story. And I knew the stance that I was taking for the structure of the short story and the narrative distance was unusual and a little bit risky, if I'm being completely honest. And so I really wanted to know if that worked or if it didn't. So I gave the beta readers about a month to get me feedback. Kit and Tom were my 2 beta readers. They gave me full permission to share their beta reader feedback, which is great. Thank you so much to both of you. And so let's go through Kit's answers. I might not go through everything, but we're gonna go through the most important points. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come up with a revision plan. Let's go through Kit's answers. Question 1, I was engaged pretty much instantly. The story has a really strong opening that quickly grips you with powerful emotions. As for the pacing, I thought the middle stalled a bit after the narrator had their last round of chemo, which I elaborate on in my answer to question 3, but overall I thought the pace was great. So I do think they have a really good point. I know exactly where it starts stalling, and I even feel like the dip in tension, and I think I need to figure out how to create that thread of tension that like continues to pull you from the beginning through a part of the middle. So I think this is a really excellent point. Did the story flow logically? Were there any moments where the narrative felt disjointed or confusing, or where the timeline was unclear? No, I didn't find anything disjointed or confusing. Time passing was executed really well with a good balance of narrative summary and honing into specific moments. Question 3. The narrator in the story is definitely at a distance. We don't get many details about them. Did that bother you, or do you think it was effective? I personally would have liked more details about the narrator, or the same amount, just more focused on revealing their character. I feel this would have afforded more depth to the central relationship and may have helped with pacing. I already mentioned that I felt the story's pace suffered a bit after the narrator finished cancer treatment, and I think that's down to the fact that I thought the story's overarching thread would be the narrator's experience with chemo. So when that thread ended and the story went on, things felt a bit directionless until I picked up where the ending was headed. So I think this is super valid. And I think what this means is that the narrative distance actually hurt the story a little bit. Also, what this beta reader feedback is indicating is that, you know, in any story, there's like the promise of the premise. As a writer, you kind of frame the story, you initialize the story in this way that makes the reader kind of like contemplate where the ending is going to go. And I think the way that I opened it is not necessarily super indicative of where the story actually ends up. And I think that is a problem, and I actually want to flag that as something that I should change. Okay, question 4. Which moments felt the most emotionally powerful to you? Were there any scenes that fell flat or felt forced? I found the description of the narrator's first experience with chemotherapy, the ending, of course, to all be particularly powerful moments. As for the thing that felt flat or forced, honestly, not much. Just really nice. Okay, question 5. Did you feel there was too much telling versus showing? This didn't strike me as a problem. There were instances where emotions were told, but I felt it worked with the narrative premise of someone retelling past events and emotions. A lot of the places where the narrator's past emotions were told served to accentuate their present emotions. The natural dichotomy of first past POV is used to great effect. That's great. That was something that I was actually like really intentional about, and so I'm really glad that that came through. That's awesome. What theme stood out to you the most? Did the story explore themes in a way that felt meaningful and natural? The themes that stuck out to me the most were grief and companionship. I think with a more fleshed out narrator, these topics could have potentially been covered with more depth, but as it stands, I don't have any complaints about the execution. The narrator's grief was written very well. The same goes for all of the story's emotions, really. That makes me really happy. Did the narrator's voice feel authentic and consistent throughout the story? Were there any passages where the tone fell off or out of place? The voice and style of the prose felt consistent throughout. The only thing that tripped me up in this area was a tonal shift halfway through the first scene that felt a bit jarring. Yeah. So this is very valid. How effective were the descriptions? Were there any points where more or less detail would have improved the narrator? I thought this was one of the story's strengths. Though a good deal of it was in narrative summary, the specific and sensory details ensured it was still vivid. Awesome. Okay, question 9. I really liked the ending, how quickly everything happened, the tense rhythm of the prose and the narrator's emotional reactions all felt perfect to me. I've read the story a few times at this point, and I've teared up at the end every single time. Yeah, it's a really sad story. If you can't tell, I was like really sad during this time. And I think I used this short story to like kind of like get those emotions out. Question 10. So many great lines. This one stood out to me in particular. And now I know I'm losing it because I think there's a little piece of you in every brown insect I see, especially dragonflies. So much of the conflicting emotions of grief, hope, loss, exhaustion, gratitude captured in one sentence. I don't think the story has any pacing problems to do with length, more so with content and expectations, which I elaborate on in question 3. Okay, so it seems like from Kit's feedback, there's a lot of things that are working. I think the 2 major things that I'm flagging that I need to work on are the narrative distance and like trying to insert a little bit more character from the narrator into the story, and 2 is really working on the middle. And maybe that has to do with working on the promise of the premise and also making sure the tension stays throughout the middle through like any sort of like internal arcs, things like that. Okay, let's move on to Tom's feedback. So Tom's feedback is quite long, so I don't know if I'm gonna like read through everything. I might like pick out a couple of points. So first off, thanks so much for letting me read the story. Usual disclaimer that everything here is my opinion, so take or leave what doesn't align. He's tried to cover everything from the original questionnaire, but he kind of like reordered the topic, so it's not going to be in the same kind of like format as Kit's. So this is where we get into conflicting territory. I do think no matter what, even if they did like it or they did not like the story, I think it's always great to look at beta reader feedback with a critical eye. Don't take it personally. It's so hard to do, but like, don't take it personally. This is craft. They are trying to help you make the story better according to their lens, according to their subjective lens. That is key. It's their subjective lens. Let's start off with Tom's. I'm not going to read through all of this, but one of Tom's major points is that he thinks it's way too heavy on narrative summary. So he thinks there's a really big showing versus telling problem, which you can see based off of Kit's feedback. She did not think that there was a big showing versus telling problem. So Tom says here, my main issue with the current framing device is that it doesn't feel like telling the story is really helping the MC make any realizations. It feels like they've already made whatever realizations they need to, and they're telling the story after that happened. Because we're not with them as they gain that perspective, it doesn't feel like there's really any sense of movement or payoff. It feels more like a journal than a story. And because there's so much summary, a lot of beats didn't make me feel as emotionally as I expected to. So I think that this is super valid. And I know I knew I was taking a risk by using quite a bit of telling versus showing, because I kind of wanted there to be this like momentum, this feeling of like this was in the past. I wanted it to be this vignette of like pulling feelings of the past, but like I wanted to give it this overwhelming sense of like, what is a relationship over time, right? Because over time, you're not, how do I say this? You're not living in the past, but you can pull out like specific memories from the past. And I really wanted the short story to be this feeling of like pulling out specific memories and having a relationship build on specific memories that you have of a specific relationship, if that makes sense. So I think also Tom is suggesting that I need to put a little bit more character in with narrative. So those are one thing that Tom and Kit agree on. We need a little bit less narrative distance and we need to insert a little bit more character. Tom's feedback is great because he like pulls out specific quotes, and I actually don't really want to show you all of it because it's like a lot of the story. So we're gonna kind of like just pull certain things. And so he kind of like pulls out specific moments where he said he really can empathize with the MC, but he kind of wants me to start the story maybe a little bit earlier in order to establish a connection with the main character, what their life looked like before this like very big emotional thing happens to them. I think to keep the story with so much distance, the narrative premise would need more expansion. What journey is the MC making in real time as they tell the story? Without that, I'm just not sure what having so much distance adds. And I think that's super valid. If I'm being completely honest, I think that could have just been like lazy writing on my part. I almost didn't want the main character of the story to be the focus. Like I wanted the relationship to almost be the main character of the story, but that doesn't work clearly. And so I think that is something that both Tom and Kit agree on. We need to decrease the narrative distance, add a little bit more character and context and backstory for the main character. Pacing and engagement. The story definitely had me hooked at the start. The opening came right in with the central problem and had some really visceral emotions. That whole section up to the MC getting the puppy had a great sense of forward momentum. I think after that it started to lose me, which also agrees with Kit. I think, the middle really winds up suffering because this thing happens and then there's like a relief of this thing and then you like lose all of this tension actually. And so I need to figure out a way to kind of like keep the conflict and keep the tension going even after there's a kind of like that little dip in events. And Tom also suggests that the narrative distance meant that there weren't turning points to keep pulling me forward. So I think I need to really add some emotional tension there. And he also says that it's quite a bit of summary as well. Okay, So I think this is really helpful feedback. I don't think any moment here is unnecessary for a story like this, but as I've said, I think it just needs more grounding, either a stronger narrative premise with an emotional journey of its own to justify why the story is being told at such a distance, or some concrete vignettes to get into the mind of the MC as all this happens in real time. In that new context, none of these moments should feel unnecessary. Honestly, up to this point, Tom and Kit kind of agree, and they're flagging very similar points, which is great. Causality and flow. I think the causality is pretty good. There were a few moments where I lost track of the timeline or felt like I'd missed something. The ending. I think the ending has every ingredient it needs to be satisfying, but right now it's being held by a lack of setup and some over-explaining. Yeah, so this is all really great feedback. I think also, one thing that's really easy to think about when you do get beta reader feedback is, oh my God, like I have so much work to do, like there are so many edits to be made, and then you can kind of start feeling overwhelmed. Like as I'm reading through this feedback, like I'm starting to feel a little bit overwhelmed, but I don't think it'll be that much. Emotions. There are great emotions when the story sinks into our particular moment, but outside of that, I'm being held at too much of a distance to really feel things. All the ingredients are there, they just need some more detail. And then Tom continues to say, when the story fully leans into specificity, there are some really great descriptions. Tom like pulled out specific sections to like show me examples of what he meant. I don't want to show it to you because I don't want you to like read the whole story. But he says, I think there's still plenty of room to punch up a lot of description and make it more specific. Always asking, is this the most interesting detail that could be chosen here? So I think what I'm hearing from Tom is there are moments where the story's hitting, it's doing exactly what I want to do, but then I kind of fade into too much telling. It loses him as a reader, which is interesting because I think Kit suggested something similar, but I think they're kind of disagreeing on the emotional impact. Like it seems like Kit, from the emotional perspective, the story is actually really hitting the emotional beats for her, but for Tom, it's not. I think the narrative distance for Tom is way more detrimental to the story than it is for Kit. So that is something like, I don't know if you're seeing me being constructive with the beta reader feedback, trying to almost dissect how they're different for the two people, but like what is the common thread? I think that's really important. I've known both Tom and Kit for a couple years now. We've been in Writer's Block Discord for quite a while, which is a great Discord server for writing. If any of you are interested in joining our writing community, I will link an invitation to the Discord server below. Okay, conclusion for Tom's feedback. I really did enjoy this piece, I think with some targeted revisions, particularly focused on specificity, refining the narrative premise, and control of psychic distance / time dilation. This will be a great moving story. I'd love to see what you do with it. Okay, so we got our beta reader feedback. I think it's really interesting to see how different people respond to a story. I think there's things that both Tom and Kit are picking up on for the story that are actually similar. I think the story dips in the middle, and I think I need to put some stronger specificity, some stronger vignetting, letting the reader sink into the moment, because at the moment I think the middle really does. It's like one thing after another and you don't really like sink into the moment. Adding more character detail in the very beginning will really help the story out as well. So I think my revision plan for the story is 1, I don't want to change the beginning of the story because I think both Tom and Kit were engaged with the story from the very beginning, and I think that actually worked out really well. I think I need to add a couple of sentences here and there to just build the character. Then I think I also need to beef up the middle, and I don't know if I need to like include new vignettes, but whatever vignettes I do have, I think I need to ground the reader in character and specificity a little bit more. And I think I need to figure out a tension arc or like a conflict arc that strings the end of the first vignette to the middle. I think right now the story is suffering from not having that, and that is why the middle dips the way that it does. And so I think the majority of the work needs to happen in the middle section, beefing up the vignettes, beefing up the specificity, beefing up the character as well. I think it's interesting because Tom says that the ending didn't hit for him emotionally in the way that he wanted it to, but for Kit it did. And so I think what I want to do is actually keep the ending the same, because I think the ending is, according to like my author vision, I think it's exactly the way that I want it to be actually. I think what Tom is referring to is the middle is suffering. Louis is taking a stretch. The middle is suffering, and because the middle is suffering, it means that the payoff and the buildup when we get to the very end feels a little dull. And so I think in order to fix that, I need to beef up the middle quite a bit. So that's my plan. Beef up character a bit, try to insert a couple lines here and there. I'm gonna need to think a little bit more critically about how I wanna beef up the character, because I want the reader to empathize, and I think the reader does empathize because the story opens with this girl getting diagnosed with cancer. And so it's like a very emotional scene, but I think the thing that this story is struggling with is like you come out of the gates just like super strong, super emotional, super heavy, and I need to lay a little bit more groundwork. But because I think the opening starts off so high and emotional, when you get that dip, when we actually start like continuing to the middle of the story, I lose attention of the readers. And I think that's something that both Kit and Tom are flagging. And so you can see what I'm doing is like, I'm taking all of their beta reader feedback, but I'm trying to like formulate a theory of like what they both kind of agree on so that I can make the story stronger, if that makes sense. That is my plan for beta reader revisions. I hope you found this video helpful to kind of like go through very specific feedback. And I know it's not ideal because ideally you'd be able to read the story and be like, oh yeah, that feedback makes sense. I'm not prepared to share the story yet, unfortunately. But you can see I'm kind of trying to take the feedback, see how it lines up between the two beta readers, see what they agree on. And I know if they're agreeing on something, then like that is something that absolutely needs addressing. And they tended to agree on most fronts. On a couple fronts, I think a little bit less so. I think, you know, the narrative distance was a little bit more of a problem for Tom than it was for Kit, but that's okay. I think it still is something that I need to work on. I think the thing with this story that makes beta reader feedback a little bit easier is like, I do have a very clear vision for what I want the story to be. And I think that actually really helps me, because I think if I went into beta reader feedback and revisions without a very clear vision for what I want the story to be, I think incorporating feedback and understanding what I should or should not take would actually be way more challenging. And so what I would really recommend, if you are interested in getting beta readers, interested in getting their feedback, interested in applying their feedback to revisions, just have a very clear picture for what you want the story to be and take their feedback, obviously with a little bit of a grain of salt, but they can see the story clearer than you can because you're the one who wrote it. And so take their feedback seriously. And I'm so eternally grateful that I have two such wonderful beta readers that like really took the time, gave me such thorough feedback with detail and like such a deep understanding of the craft. Like that was super helpful to get feedback from readers but also writers, and they could really help me pinpoint exactly where the story felt weakest. Really huge thanks to Tom and Kit because they were such wonderful beta readers, and I'm so grateful. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it helpful. If you did, please like and subscribe. And as always, I will see you in the next one.